Why respond? Why would I even look at this video? You gotta ask yourself. You've seen me do a 2-hour response to videos like this. I've explained the double slit experiment, how it actually works. But the screenshot shows, or the thumbnail shows another experiment talking about causality. It's a different thing. But he had to say the double slit experiment wrong. I've already caught him in the first 2 minutes of his video. If you exclude the ad. You know we're gonna get into it, so let's just get into it.
Come on down, who do you think you are?
Hold on, I'm kidding. Okay, let's get into the real video.
Through the slit. At first, you will.
To preface this, okay, double slit experiment, been done to death, always get done wrong, and we know this guy's gonna do that wrong, but what else is he gonna say? What is the new thing that he has to add about a different experiment also done by people who aren't even thinking about the electromagnetic field whatsoever? They're thinking about electrons and photons, and they're not thinking about the electromagnetic field itself. They don't know how it works. They don't get it. They're out of touch. I gave him an F already.
I want to point out that the authors of the original 1998 paper, who were the first to conduct the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, implied retrocausality, or the future.
This is beyond double slit experiment nonsense. This is straight out of pocket. I don't like this.
Affecting the past. That's why in my original video, I presented it that way, and several other YouTubers have done the same. The authors wouldn't be wrong if one interprets the results of their experiment in a non-standard way. But I now admit that my buying into that interpretation was incorrect. The experiment...
Oh, you have no idea how much you're not correct about at times, and still getting wrong in this video. Let's watch.
It was clarified to me by one of my very astute viewers.
Not me.
Who has a PhD in quantum optics.
No.
So he understands the details of this experiment a lot better than I do.
And you still... This is the... Okay, what we're hearing is a professional.
And as he pointed out to me, the devil is in the details.
Oh,
so
yeah.
How and why did the original authors conclude that this experiment implies retrocausality? And why is it that I'm now saying this is wrong? I know that there are a couple of videos on YouTube now that have debunked the retrocausality claim, but I found those videos to still be a little confusing and lacking some details. So stay tuned.
He hasn't watched my videos. I know. Because I've been looking at my comments and he would have left one. And I would have been on a mailing, like, what do you call it? Pen pal type connection with this guy. Never fucking talked to him.
Because I'm going to simplify this notoriously confusing experiment so that hopefully anyone with a little science background can understand it. That's coming up.
Oh, I wish you understood it.
Right now.
I wish you understood stuff.
Before I explain how the delayed choice experiment actually works,
Let me get a drink. Let's start. We're good. We're ready now.
it means and what I got wrong. I need to say that this video would not be possible without today's sponsor display. Basically, the retrocausal conclusion of the original paper requires a non-standard interpretation of quantum mechanics. It implies retrocausality if you assume a classical way of thinking. What I mean by that is you have to interpret that the photon is either a particle or a wave from the moment it left the light source. So,
1. It's a particle. 2. There are waves involved. You're not mentioning it? Immediate F. I will not apologize. You got a complete, absolute, you flubbed it record on your score, and I'm not going to retract that. That's staying for the rest of your life, and that's how you have to feel about it. Yeah, even if this video is taken down, you got an F. Feel bad. But why? Oh, I've explained why in other videos.
when you decide how to measure it later, for example, if you measure it to be a wave, it must retrocausally become.
Look, you don't decide shit. You do experiments and you find out, hey, what actually takes place? Noticing that you see these particles, these little dots on your results of photons, means that you got photons going on. Individual dots. So what's up with the waviness of stuff if it's dots? How it travels through the air hasn't been visually recorded. Visually recording light traveling through the air? Yeah, though that's never fucking happened. Because in order to do that, you gotta be accurate to the speed of light. It's really hard to get that on camera without certain camera functions and stuff being like, oh yeah, we got a picture of that photon with how you take a picture of a photon with a photon. But for real, we don't have that ability to have it visualized. Never mind, let's move on.
A wave when it was created before you decided to measure it. And the same thing applies if you measure it to be a particle. However, this retrocausal interpretation falls apart if you assume the more standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, where a photon in flight is in a superposition of states. In other words,
we all know that's bullshit. Honey, we know that it's bullshit. Because a photon randomly deciding that it's going to snap from a position of here and there is so much pseudoscience. You gotta write that shit on a napkin and it still don't make sense. But you're gonna say it like you believe it. And that's the sad truth. You do that. And you're saying it to people on the internet. Everyone else has been saying it. And it's like, you got no objectivity whatsoever. You're gonna just say that.
it is a wave of potentiality.
No.
Once it's measured, that is, once its path is known, the wave collapses to become a
This is
localized
stupid.
wave.
Look at the visual again. Look at this. You got what is that? A fucking camera? You got a camera? I don't think so. How do you think you're gonna be seeing this stuff? No, what you have to sense what this stuff is another laser going across, and the particles that are being shot along with electromagnetic field that is making the interference pattern. Because guess what? When we shoot these things, we're shooting them without any interaction between the individual particles. So they can't act like a wave like classical fluid mechanics. So what would act like a wave like classical fluid mechanics? The electromagnetic field itself is there ahead of the electron, ahead of the photon, gets excited, it goes through the slit, it makes the interference pattern, it shows where it's gonna end up putting the photons or the electrons. All this is happening in a fraction of a second. You're nuts if you think it is some random stuff and then it suddenly decides that it's going to be somewhere else. As if it wasn't a ball that was thrown and ended up exactly where you expected it to be.
And that shows up as a particle distribution on the screen. But if it is not measured, that is, its path information is not known, it remains a wave and will show up as an interference pattern, like a wave that interferes with another.
It doesn't show up as an interference pattern. It shows up as particles that went through the interference pattern's pressure zones, low pressure zones, where all the high pressure is on the sides of it, and it goes through, and it is only able to go into these bands because it's being pushed on either side by the waves of something. And what is that something? The EM field itself. Photons and electrons are not the EM field. They are a particle in the EM field. Get it right.
If you consider this latter interpretation, there's no retrocausality whatsoever. To understand what's really going on.
Dude, I wouldn't even have retrocausality be in my mind. I know how this frickin' works. Causality of like, oh, it happening here and it happening there. That doesn't even happen. That's not even a postulate. That's like you just made some shit up and you're saying it to me as if you actually considered it, which makes you look dumb. But I'm talking to not just you, I'm talking to that professional. Shut up!
And let me first start out by explaining how the simpler double-slit experiment works. If you send photons, electrons, or any quantum object one at a time through the slits, at first you will see what looks like a random distribution of dots. But after a while, you'll see that those dots create an interference pattern. It's as if little bits of waves were going through the slits and interfering with each other.
No, honey. It's called the EM field makes the interference pattern no matter how many, 1 electron per second or whatever. Because that's the waves of the EM field. Right? Works like a fluid. It does its own thing. The electrons are just going along for the ride in the already made geometry of where the interference pattern is making them go. It can't be any different. And what happens when you have the observer? You have a laser beam going across the thing, and it breaks off the interference pattern. It's forced to go nothing but straight, pretty much. With the deviation of where it was versus where it was in the gun.
The weirdness doesn't stop there. If you then put detectors on the slits to measure which slit the photon passes through, then you don't see an interference pattern. You see a pattern like you would if you...
I hate improper representation of the actual experiment itself because the detector is a goddamn laser and you know it.
We're sending individual particles through the slits.
It's not a camera. It's a laser.
Seems to affect the results. This phenomenon has resulted in...
You see, because light in the room is everywhere, so the EM field is being bombarded by light anyway. A normal camera wouldn't make any difference. So what would actually do it? Well, the thing that we're actually using to supposedly detect needs to be a laser. It has to be because, and that's literally what has been documented in any other talk about it. Double-slit experiment. It's a freaking laser you go across there. And you're just losing that detail entirely, calling it a camera.
All kinds of crackpot, new age quantum woo theories about universal awareness, consciousness affecting reality, and a whole lot more.
That's true. No, I'm not gonna lie. People talking about this type of stuff, oh, it has some concept of like, because the stuff is being looked at, suddenly it behaves differently. You used something to interfere with the normal function of what it would have done. Right? You blocked the interference pattern, the particle went through anyway, meaning it's not a wave, it's a dot.
Quantum physics enthusiasts probably know that the change in behavior of quantum objects does not occur because we're watching them or are conscious of them. The change is due to the nature of quantum mechanics. All quantum objects, like photons,
You say that it's not because we're watching them. Bitch! It's because we're using a laser to interfere with the thing that's doing the interference pattern. Fuck!
and electrons are really waves. But if they interact with anything, that is, if an irreversible energy exchange...
Let's just say that you weren't using a sensor, you were using a magnet or something. That has also been done with electrons, and it made them go either up or down. That's a different thing than changing whether or not it goes through some double slit and does this interference pattern nonsense. So why would it that it can possibly either go up or go down? Another example.
Change takes place, such as what happens when these quantum objects interact with the measuring device. Their waves become localized. The localized waves of electrons and photons then appear to be like classical particles. This is sometimes referred to as wave collapse. This same wave collapse occurs without the detector present when the photon interacts with the screen in the back. The photon is like a wave until it hits the screen. After hitting or interacting with the screen, the wave becomes localized, so it appears as a discrete particle. And we see this as a dot on the screen. But
that's because it physically always has been. Never would have been anything different except for a goddamn dot on the screen. As it goes through the air, it's a dot.
Prior to hitting the screen, the photon wave interacts with itself similar to the wave any classical wave would. This is why we see an interference pattern in the aggregate of many dots. This wave to particle collapse seems...
You're shooting them one at a time. They can't interact with themselves or each other because you did it in such a duration between the two shots. They can't interfere with each other. So why would they? The answer is they wouldn't. They don't.
Incredible, but that's the way quantum mechanics seems to work. How this so-called wave collapse occurs is not well understood. If you want to learn more, I have a video on this phenomenon which is now ascribed a more modern terminology called decoherence up here. The delayed choice quantum eraser is...
You get a retroactive F for that video. I'm not even going to respond to it. I'm not going to look at it. I'm not going to give it the benefit of even my presence. Fuck you. You screwed up so bad. And you still believe this stuff, that you are not getting any more attention than you deserve. This video here, because you have to mention this. And this is the whole reason I'm here. Fuck your double slit experiment stuff. I knew you were going to be wrong with that, and you're not going to get away with it. But this is the thing that's going to piss me off the most. So let's find out what this is.
Like the double slit experiment on steroids, and takes this to another level of confusion. But before I describe that, let me debunk a misleading illustration commonly shown about the double slit experiment. If you have no detectors checking the path of the particle, then you get an interference, just like I said earlier. If, however, you have a detector that measures the path, you don't really get two clear lines of photons like I illustrated. You actually get a single spread out distribution of photons. What you get depends...
Whoa. I've seen a bitch do this experiment. You get a single blur is what you're actually saying what really happens? Fuck.
on the physical dimensions of the setup. If your slit is very wide, you get a relatively concentrated dot on your screen because the photon just goes straight through, almost as if it didn't notice the slit at all. And this is the scenario you see in almost all illustrations, a double line pattern on the screen. But if you narrow the width of the slit to the size of nanometers, which you generally have to in this experiment because we're dealing with tiny quantum things, you enhance diffraction. In other words, the photons interact more with the slits, which causes the photons to spread out as a fuzzy collection of dots. They don't show up as clean, narrow lines of dots.
This is different information than what has ever been mentioned in every other video, as if evidence wasn't obvious for everyone else to also be able to show this kind of thing happening. But he's talking about, oh, you narrowed it to near the area of an atom, meaning, yeah, the walls of the double slit are made of atoms. You squeeze it so much, the electromagnetic fields around those double slits are able to interfere with, yeah, all of the electrons, protons, neutrons, stuff that makes up the double slit is so close to where you're shooting, their own influence is able to move around where the electron or photon is going to go. Like you're bouncing it off a big wall. Yeah, no, this tracks.
For the typical double slit illustration, it is okay to ignore this, but to understand the delayed choice quantum eraser, it's helpful to realize that what you should really see is a spread out pattern of dots, or an interference pattern if you don't measure which slit the photon passes through. So how does the delayed choice experiment work? Let me show you step by step. I've simplified the illustration below so that you can better follow what's going on. The actual experimental setup is a little bit different, but the practical results are the same. We have our double slit, but instead of putting up a screen to see an interference pattern, we put a special optical device called a barium borate crystal, which is referred to simply as a BBO crystal. It splits a single photon into a pair of entangled photons with half the energy each of the original. And this is done for every photon coming from either the left or right slit. Now there's a critical important point to note here, which distinguishes this from the standard double slit experiment. The process of creating entangled photons effectively results in a measurement. In other words, the way...
I'm not going to get into the fact that the term entangled photons is a faux pas and a mistake that nobody should be making, and they're doing it. They're thinking entangled. What you're doing is, if you're cutting a thing in half, it's like it's like a baseball you cut in half. Yeah, one half went this way, one half the other way. There's a correlation between the two of them, but there's no causality. That's reality.
The function of the photon collapses so that it is now a particle. And since the path from the top slit to detector 1 is slightly different than the path from detector...
Yo. There's no reason to double slit. You're not going to get any interference pattern leading towards wherever our stuff, blah, blah, blah. But also, so like, it's just the same as if you shot it through a single slit. But let's just say, oh, we're trying to really be close and just see where it ends up being shot towards. The answer is, again, the electromagnetic field goes through it. Like any wave, it will push it either to the right or the left. It'll go through the slit, it'll hit the slit, or whatever, it depends.
2, the which way information of the photon is known. This means that the pattern that will show up at detector 1 will always be a spread out pattern, not an interference pattern. Note that I said it will always show up this way, and never as an interference pattern. It doesn't matter what happens at any of the other...
Honey, the interference pattern cannot occur because it doesn't go and make an interference. It hits the crystal, and the crystal determines what it will do from there. meaning it can only be a particle just going its merry way with no deviance because there's nothing pushing on it.
Detectors. So why is it illustrated as changing depending on what happens at the other detectors? This is the center of the confusion. And to understand this, you first have to understand what happens to the entangled pairs of the photons in the rest of the apparatus. So if we follow the entangled pairs from the top slit, we see that it hits a set of beam splitters which can randomly direct the photon to either detector 2, detector 4, or detector 5. If the photon goes to detector 2, it will show a spread out pattern because its path information is known, since the photon could only have come from the top slit. Similarly, the entangled pair from the bottom slit hits a set of beam splitters which randomly directs the photon to either detector 3, detector 4, or detector 5. If the photon goes to detector 3, it will also show a spread out pattern because its path information is known. It could only have come from the bottom slit. What makes things interesting is what happens to the photons that don't end up at 2 or 3, but end up at detector 4 or 5. These photons are fed into a set of optical instruments that effectively merge the beam from the right and left slit into a single recombined beam. This is the eraser part of the experiment. It's called eraser because the photon's path or which way information in those two cases is erased. Hence, the patterns that you will see at 4 and 5 are all...
Let me make it real clear for you. Light is a bunch of photons. Depending on what part of the geometry of the prisms that you use, they will either hit and go through and end up at detector 3, or they'll hit and go through the other way, hitting with a different angle, and go down to 4. Or they'll hit and they'll go to 5. So ironically, we got it having it go to 3 different positions, and it doesn't show you anything about what's happening one side or the other because it can go here or there or there, and it's only these 3 that it can go through from the top, right? So does this experiment say for certain if it hits detector 5 or if it hits detector 4 whether or not it went for the top or bottom? The answer is in the distance between these two prisms and the distance between the prisms and detector 5 and detector 4. Clearly there is a quicker and shorter path leading from the bottom slit to the lower prism to detector 4. So if it went that way, that's the shortest path for detector 4. So if it comes with a delay, then we know it came from the upper path, because it took longer to get there by a fraction of a second. Very tiny fraction, because that area of space versus the speed of light is considered to be, I don't know, a couple 1/millionths of a second difference because of their absolute tiny distance between each other. In the actual experiment, right? Similarly, on the top path, when they get towards this top, I'll illustrate, when they get towards this one, it's the shortest path here, so if you see a shortest time duration between being shot and going here, you know it came from the top slit, based off of the time stamp. And there's only one way that it could have gone into detectors 2 or 3, and it went through either the top to get to detector 2 or bottom to get into detector 3. That's about it. So, interestingly enough, what is the fullness of all of this?
Always going to be interference patterns. This is similar to the pattern made in the double slit experiment without a measuring device. The
See-
two interference patterns from 4 and 5 look somewhat like this. Now you might ask, where does the confusion of retrocausality come in? Well, the confusion is from the way this experiment is presented. It's presented as D1 changing its pattern to match the interference pattern at D4 or D5.
Okay, listen. You said that you take D5 and D4 and you recombine with detector 1 to make a complete thing that has an interference pattern type of stuff going on. Again, if you understand how waves work, you know that the crest goes from the top slit, waves out in this direction, right? And the other one waves out in this direction. So we would see the intensity be on one side and then the waviness on that side. And we see that interference pattern because we're literally directly looking at the deviations that are possible in that entire length of this prism. But when they go directly through to sensor detector 2 or 3, chances are, I'm really confused why they don't have, for fuck's sakes, why they don't have an interference pattern in 2 or 3, I don't know.
When the photons end up there, but showing a different pattern, a spread out pattern, if the photons end up at D2 or D3. So this implies that what happens at D2, D3, D4, or D5 influences what happens at D1. But since the path to...
Wouldn't you better to imagine what happens and make hypothesis on the structure of the prisms as they're going through them and be like, okay, how can this possibly make a bigger influence? Because guess what? When the electron is going through, or the photon is going through, the travel paths of an angle, as with any prism, have the potential of making a rainbow, or a spectrum, or an interference pattern. But that means that, and what we're really noticing is the deviation of the photons in between the double slit and this white wall here.
D1 is shorter than the path to any of the other detectors. The photons reach D1 before they reach D2, D3, D4, D5. So the implication is that the pattern of D1, which would be in the past, is being affected by what happens in the future at D2, D3, D4, or D5. So people have naturally been led to think that the interference pattern of the eraser will change the result on the original D1 screen. This is wrong. If we were to turn on the experiment and show the content of all 5 screens, that is, the screen from D1, the 2 screens showing photons from the individual slits D2 and D3, and the 2 screens D4 and D5, each showing half of the recombined beam, then we would see that the patterns look something like this. The quantum eraser has no effect.
What you're getting, potentially, from 4 and 5, if you were to combine them, would look more like 3 and 2, and 1. That's curious.
On the original screen at D1. What's really happening is that the changing patterns are due to the scientists who are conducting this experiment, selecting subsets of the photons in D1 to show the same pattern as that of each of the other detectors. How is this done? Recall the first thing that happens after the double slit.
So the way you would normally do this is you would take individual snapshots of every photon division and give that its own bit of information, and then you can supersede one over the other as they do things to say where it ended up something.
Is the creation of entangled photons. This means that there is a connection between the particles hitting the screen at D1 and the particles going down to the other detectors.
There's a
where
correlation.
We either measured them coming from separate slits, causing no interference, or as the recombined beam where we see an interference pattern. Since the path information of all the photons hitting D1 is known, it is possible to single out or manually identify all individual photons ending up at any of the other detectors. In other words, using entanglement, we can recover which entangled partner photons from any of the other 4 detectors hit the screen at D1. So for example, if we manually sort out the entangled partner photons of the photons hitting D4 or D5, we can see the same exact interference pattern hidden within the spread out pattern of D1. But we see this only because we have now chosen a subsample from all the photons at D1, which of course is going to be interfering because they are entangled partners of the corresponding photons at D4 and D5. The same thing applies to D2 and D3. So in the presentations that you see, including the one I originally made, the interference pattern you see at D1 is nothing but a hand-selected subset of the actual original spread out pattern at D1, corresponding to photons that ended up at D4 or D5. In fact, if you combine the interference patterns at D4 and D5, you get a spread out pattern with no interference.
Did I fucking just say that? Did I fucking just say that?
So what the quantum eraser is doing is creating 2 subsamples of the full non-interference picture, which individually show interference, but no interference when combined.
The reason why it's able to make those subsets is because you're getting information from the particles that went in one direction that are being pushed by the waves in one direction and the ones being pushed by the waves in the other direction. It's showing the physics of the dynamics of the interference pattern, which, yeah, you do it enough and it starts to look like the full smear, because guess what? You're looking at... Now here's the weird thing, right? The positive and negative pressure zones are consistent throughout the interference pattern thing. So what's actually happening here? You say that it's going to combine together and it looks like the thing in full, when in reality these aren't lined up right. This top one needs to be, that bright spot is the same bright spot for the bottom one. It's the same bright spot. It's not that they can combine to make a smear that makes sense. It's that you shouldn't have, you're skewed with your combining. Pretty sure. Because you're forgetting about where all of this is coming from. the geometry of a wave and you're cutting it in half,
Now here's the clincher. If you combine all the patterns from D2, D3, D4, and D5, you get precisely the same pattern that you have at D1. This should make sense because every entangled pair that ends up at D1 has a corresponding pair that ends up at one of the other 4 detectors. So really, you're not changing the past. What you're really doing is, in the future, you are choosing a subsample of the data you made in the past. So I hope you find comfort in knowing that no...
Listen, you still get an F because, first of all, when you're making these patterns, the entire smear was made over a long period of time where they shot individual particles. And the entire pattern over there, like there's gaps between all of this happening. You don't get just, oh, a photon, a whole interference pattern shows up. It doesn't do that for every photon. However you're doing it, you're still doing it wrong. I need more drink. Look. What happens when the light hits these two signals is that the spread out of the wave is detected in two halves. And not specifically two halves of the full interference pattern wave. We're losing a lot of that information. We're only getting snippets of the top half of the wave and the bottom half of the wave going through those prisms that we see there. Top half, bottom half. So, the thing about that is that the intensity of these things and everything like that goes through, does its thing, and if you literally are using prisms, that's not the same thing as a bitch using mirrors. This is the real thing. Talking about mirrors, not prisms. Do you know why? Because optically they're freaking different. And what will happen is sometimes the light actually goes directly through the mirror because it doesn't hit anything on the way through. Because those mirrors are so thin or whatever else, somehow it made it all the way through without bumping into something that would have directed it towards the other thing. So, you are misinterpreting it, or you're misrepresenting it by using prisms in how you show it, because the way light works in prisms is different. So it makes your mind think different things. You got an F.
D4 or D5. In fact, if you combine the interference patterns at D4 and D5, you get a spread out pattern with no interference. So what the quantum eraser is doing is creating two subsamples of the full non-interference picture, which individually show interference but no interference when combined.
The problem is, if you try doing that, you're forgetting the geometry of an interference pattern, what physically is taking place as the interference pattern takes place. It's a spread out thing. You're not supposed to combine them, okay? This is not how physics works, okay? Because the physical half here is spread out this way. The physical half here is spread out this way. There is no combining. That's misinterpreting the information. So the fact that you say that means you're not critically thinking about how it's happening. That's gross. Literally gross. Even though, and I will say, yeah, I said that you would combine them together and you would see the whole thing. I didn't say, I said the pictures would combine and it would make sense that you'd see the same thing on the separate ones as you see in the one on the top, the number one. Because what you see on the top of number one, that's an interference pattern. That's what's happening. So what is going on with all this? All I can say is this guy butchered the heck out of this experiment a number of different ways. He's forgetting how interference patterns work with light. Why you don't combine these this way to make a completed thing? That's not how this works at all. You can't physically do that. You can't imagine that physically happens. Because that's not what light does as it goes through it all. It goes through the spreading. Because that's physically what is taking place there. As if there are channels that it can go through. They can't use the negative space. Because it's literally, there is a high pressure zone, my finger, low pressure zone, the area between my fingers. This is also what's happening with the electromagnetic field through the thing. It makes high and low pressure zones, just like when you have water. You make the interference pattern because of the high-low pressure zones. Parts where it's high, where they're interfering and they both cancel to make a or add together to make a positive, and low where it makes a dip. That's an interference pattern. We've seen it in another video. I'm done. You got an F. Holy crap. No, I can't give you just an F. This is worse than an F. This is an F on interference pattern. This second part of the thing. And the fact that you dared to... Listen. This was subterfuge. This freaking bullshit here, this was a lie. This whole thing here with the ball, you don't see that. This is not observed. This was a complete fabrication to try to make the rest of it seem like he knows what he's talking about, and he doesn't. And I'm sorry to tell you this, Mr. Scientist, optic person, but if you're not someone who is thinking critically about the physics of what's happening to the electrons or the photons in the experiments, you're flat out wrong. I don't even know who you are, but I'm sorry, you get an F also. This is multiple Fs, and if you have someone who supposedly fact checks all this stuff, they get an F. There are very few things you ever said that are correct about any of this. The only thing you said that was correct is it's spread out when you're not using the observer, which is a laser. He doesn't say the laser part, so you get an F. Or you get at least... That is the only time you get a C. That's the one time you get a C, is how you explain this whole model. You're forgetting it's a laser. You're not saying it's a laser. That detector is a freaking laser, okay? That's how that works. 2. The whole thing about the EM field, you're not even mentioning it, that's an F. Lowers your score down even worse. 3. You got the freaking triangles. They're not triangles. They are actually mirrors, because that's what's actually physically there in the real experiment. Your interpretation is a butchery of this. Flat out butchery. And the whole causality stuff is like, yeah, how would a photon from nanoseconds in the future know anything about what's happening in the slight area of what already divided unless it was backwards causal connected? It's more like the thing that is doing the dividing, this bar here that they're using in front of the double slit, is what is really creating ooh. That bar. Also, yeah, they are mirrors. They are not prisms. There's a difference because of the way light travels through prisms, because of the travel time being different through every bit of it. The reason why it would go straight through to the other side, it's a mirror. It's one of those two-way mirror type things where it's supposed to be able to go through one side. Of course, all two-way mirrors, like you've seen it, right? All those two-way mirrors where you have it so that, oh, you can't see through the other side, but they can see you. Light's still going through for both of you. You could be able to see through the other side, but you don't. The two-way mirror type of thing is what's happening here, and we're seeing how much light is going through it. Specifically, we're trying to see where in the double slits things happen and how often and frequent that happens and everything else. He's skimming over a lot of this stuff. He's getting it flat out wrong in his interpretation because I don't know why. Stylistically, he chose prisms. If we take that out of the whole thought process and say just chalk that up to a typo. Well, we could chalk the prisms up to a typo, and I will say you're still getting a damn F because you said the interference pattern could possibly be combined. I'm in shock. Can't be saying this shit.
The actual original spread out pattern corresponding to photons that ended up at D4 or D5. In fact, if you combine the interference patterns at D4 and D5, you get a spread out pattern with no interference. So what the quantum eraser is doing...
No, that is something you manufactured, or the person who explained it to you manufactured. I'm sorry you got misinformed, but that is a complete F. Physics doesn't do that. It's wrong that you would ever be told this, and I'm sorry that you're saying this to the entire internet expecting them to listen to you. And it makes total sense. It's so beautifully elegant, lovely. It's animated. Oh, it's good, but it's such garbage. I have plushies.
Is creating two subsamples of the full non-interference picture, which individually show interference, but no interference when combined. Now here's the clincher. If you combine all the patterns from D2, D3, D4, and D5, you get precisely the same pattern that you have at D1. This should make sense because every entangled pair that ends up at D1 has a corresponding pair that ends up at one of the other 4 detectors. So really, you're not changing the past. What you're really doing is, in the future, you are choosing a subsample of the data you made.
You're just observing at a different time frame. The length of time between events only shows absolute nothing. But if you simply made it so that time was not a factor in this, you made them all the same distance as in with the first one, yeah, you would end up with... Oh, by the way, combining the beam, again, is combining how... It's the combining of number one that is misleading you the most, because you're combining parts that went in from a wave in one side and a wave in another side, and you're saying we're going to reinterpret that as if that's actually what's taking place, like right in front of it, but that's not, and you know that's not. You know that's a misinterpret. That number one is the worst censor of them all because it is complete bald-faced lying about what's happening to you. And then you're saying, well, we see interference patterns on these two ones. Yeah, that's what's actually happening. And then you see nothing of the sort because the mirrors, as they go directly through, it is mirrors, by the way, not prisms. It goes directly through, you end up with a blur on number 2 and 3 because there's literally not much deviation whatsoever. It's the fact that they're going straight through. When they have the ability to be reflected, any amount of deviation sideways also becomes a deviation as they go down. Again, you would see that if you're looking at proper mirrors. Prisms, that, just get that out of your head. That no one would do that experiment and call it the way that he's saying it. They would know what happens to light when it goes through a prism. You'd also get, you know what, it might actually be a better experiment because you get rainbow, and then you could easily know, okay, it had to have hit not just here on the prism, because that's the only place that it would hit that would make that color of light. That's really accurate and a better test, but that's not what they fucking did
in the past. So I hope you find comfort in knowing that no one in the future can mess up your present. They can only mess up your future. What do you think?
You messed up my past. Because all of this happened a moment ago. And none of this would have happened if it wasn't for the fact that you, in the past, messed up my, now the past. It's a stupid way of saying it. Just proves the point. It's like, oh, one thing happened, then another thing happened, then, oh, it all checks out. Yeah, duh. That's my point of the video. Thanks for listening to my... I'm better at freaking TED Talk. Shut up.
Comment. I'll see you in the next.
TED Talks have gotten things wrong too, by the way. Just because smart people are saying it, and just because they've been at it for years or decades, doesn't mean they're correct. People can still get this stuff wrong. Relativity is a goddamn hoax. Made up and perpetuated by people who don't know any better. Or they do know better and they just don't want to say it. Chances are they just don't know any better. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say they did not understand what the hell they were looking at, and they did not understand anything of the physics of what would actually be happening in this situation. They don't get it. Because they're not in the field. They're not cross-referencing. They're not getting a bundle of information like I do to make sure it freaking is accurate. So they fail, and here we go. Give me a Nobel Prize for this shit. If you ever understand and listen to these videos and get it in your head about what is actually happening, that there are electrons or photons, they're both particles. Photons are way smaller, but they still are governed by what you would think fluid mechanics, right? But that's not what's happening. Because when you send them individually, you send them without being able to interfere with each other. Interfering with each other is what makes fluid mechanics work. Interference patterns are a fluid mechanic thing. So what's happening with the fluid... Oh, I shaved, by the way. What's happening with the fluid is the EM field. Particles are just along for the ride. All of this stuff about combining the beams is absolute. Yeah, your brain can do that. Don't take that as empirical evidence, because that stuff is brain rot. Literally, it's like doing a YTP of science. Knock it off. We're here to be subjective. We're here to know what actually is taking place. And if you're doing it like that, if you're going to just mix it up in your head and get all these bits of data and say, oh, we can rearrange them any way we want, and it doesn't make it freaking makes a difference. I can illustrate exactly the interference pattern, the waves, the way that it makes sense about them being separate, and how they pan off in one way, they pan off in the other way. I could do that visual for you. It's not that I'm too lazy to do it, it's that I'm not doing it in this video. I may do it in a video in the future. I'm sorry that I haven't done it yet. But we've seen interference patterns. You can imagine what they look like in half. We've done a reaction video that was hours long about that. I'm done. Doodles.